In this next section, we'll be talking about the phylum Mollusca, and these include snails, clams, and octopus, among others. This is a nudibranch, which is a snail that doesn't have a shell, so sometimes they're called sea slugs. And here's an octopus and a scallop. So a little bit of background about Mollusca. There are about 110,000 species, and they are economically important as food. Clams, oysters, scallops, octopus, squid, snails. You guys have probably all eaten these foods. And they're also economically important for other things such as the pearls that oysters make, and they make buttons out of shells and lots of other things, jewelry. And they're also not just in the ocean like some of the things we're talking about. There are many on land too. And so they can also be pests in agriculture, such as snails and slugs, which I'm sure you've had. If you've ever had a garden, you've probably had some snails there eating your vegetables. And also shipworms. They're called worms, but they're not really worms at all. They're mollusks. And also, we use their shell as a source of calcium. Some of the general features are that they have a foot that is modified for locomotion so they can move around, and their mantle is a thin tissue that secretes the calcium carbonate shell, sorry. And they also have a radula, which is kind of like a file. It's made of chitin, and it's what they use to eat with. So it's normally a rasping file, and they can rasp algae off things, but some of them will be modified to be a drill where they can drill into other species and eat what's inside, or a harpoon like the cone snail. And we'll be talking about each one of those. This is a cowrie, and I'm sure you've all seen cowrie shells. They have on the bottom, it looks like 2 rows of teeth, but when they're alive, they have the mantle that comes out around, and this mantle will go out and over the shell, and it secretes the shell. So that's why these shells stay super, super shiny, because their mantle is always secreting shell. And also, one of the interesting things is as it secretes the shell, it lays down layers. So just like you can tell how old a tree is by the rings on a tree, you can also tell how old a snail is by how many layers it has. Here's a diagram of a snail, and you can see that it has its shell. Inside the shell, it has all of its internal organs, and now these animals are getting to be more complex. So they have gills so they can breathe underwater, and they have their mouth with rasping parts. It goes into their stomach, and an unfortunate thing with snails, though, their anus is right above their head. And so, anyways, they have their gonads, their digestive glands, stomach. They have a lot of parts that some of the other animals we've seen haven't had yet. And many of these snails use their radula to scrape algae off the reef. So you can see down here at the bottom is a close-up of radula, what the radula looks like. Snails and all of the mollusks are bilaterally symmetrical. They don't have segmentation like some of the worms did. They have a small coelom or body cavity, and they have a complete digestive tract, which means food goes in, goes all the way through a stomach, and comes out an anus. They mostly breathe with gills. Some of them can breathe through their mantle, and others have primitive lungs. And some of the forms have open circulation and others have closed. And their internal organs are all together in what's called a visceral mass. This is a diagram of a scallop or clam, and you can see all the parts here. So clams even have a heart. They have a kidney, a heart, a stomach. They have lots of different parts. The reproduction in these mollusks varies depending on which kind of mollusk you're looking at. Some of them have simple broadcast of sperm and eggs, so they're broadcast spawners. They just release their eggs and sperm into the water. Other ones have elaborate mating procedures, and these are mostly octopus and squid. They transfer sperm from the male to the female, and the eggs are cared for by the adults. And in many of these, they have a larval stage called a veliger, and this is a veliger larvae. So sometimes when we look at plankton, we can find larvae of snails that looks like this. These are some veliger larvae. So the identifying features are these. They look like wings or like elephant ears, and those come out of the shell, and they use those to swim around. Some forms, like the clams, they have very simple nervous system, but in the cephalopods, which are the group that includes octopus and squid, they have very advanced nervous systems. They have sensory organs including eyes, and they have chemical and touch receptors, which are located in their head. And the cephalopod's eyes are derived from their skin, and they're a very amazing eye that's even more efficient than ours, so they can see very well. And they also have chromatophores, which are cells that can change color. So if you've ever seen an octopus in the water, as soon as it lands on something, it can change colors. And also many of the squid change colors too, and they can flash colors if they feel threatened or excited. Pretty cool. They are found in the ocean. They're also found on land and in fresh water. So snails and other mollusks are found everywhere. Many of them are benthic. They live on the bottom, but some are pelagic and they float around in the ocean. And many of them in the ocean have planktonic larvae. So they release their eggs and sperm into the water, and they will form little larvae that float around in the plankton until they settle down and grow up into an adult. They are heterotrophs, which means they can't make their own food. They have to eat, and they're primary and secondary consumers. So a primary consumer is a vegetarian, something that only eats plants, and a secondary consumer is something that eats the primary consumers. And we will be talking about this much more in the section on ecology. And if you'd like to skip ahead in your book, you can always go check out the chapter 10 on ecology and look more about feeding levels. And some of them have symbiotic zooxanthellae in them, just like the corals. And these are single-celled dinoflagellates, which can photosynthesize and provide food for the animal that it lives with symbiotically. And one of the ones that does this are the giant clams. They are a very successful group, and the major groups are the gastropoda, which is the stomach foot, is what it means, and those are the gastropods, which are snails, slugs, and sea hares. Bivalvia are the clams and oysters. The things that means two shells, so bivalve. They have two shells. And then cephalopoda means head, foot, and those are the octopus, squid, and chambered nautilus, things like that. Some of the minor classes are Polyplacophora, the chitons, and the Scaphopoda, the toothed shells. And we'll be looking at all these. The chitons are, there's about 80 species, and they have 8 overlapping shell plates. They live on hard substrates, and most of them eat by scraping algae with their rasping radula. And this is what a chiton looks like. If you go down to the tide pools, you might see some. The ones we have here in Hawaii are quite small. They're not real brightly colored. They're pretty plain looking, more like these right here. In some other places in the world, in colder water, they can grow to be quite large. Next group is the gastropoda, or stomach foot, and these include the snails and nudibranchs. There are over 75,000 species. This is the largest class. They have coiled visceral mass enclosed by a dorsal shell, so that means they have a shell on their back, which rests on their creeping muscular foot. And that goes for most of them except for the nudibranchs, because the nudibranchs have lost their shell. So here we go again. Here are these gastropods. So gastropods are, most of them are herbivorous. That means they eat plants, and they are the ones that have that radula that they rasp the algae off with. So limpets, cowries, abalone, things like that. There are some sea hares that are grazers, and some of them have a symbiotic relationship with chloroplasts. And this is a pretty cool thing. Imagine this. These sea hares can eat algae, and they can harvest the chloroplasts, which are the part that photosynthesizes and makes energy. They can harvest those. They carry them in their back, and the sun shines on these they're sea hares, they're shellless snails. The sun shines on them, and they can get food from the chloroplasts that they've harvested. So when I was in grad school, my office mate was actually working on these, and she was looking to see how long they could go without food. And she had some of them for over 6 months, and they never had to eat, and they still were alive by just having sunlight to make their own food. So they don't really make their own food in their own body, but they can harvest those, kind of like if you had a solar panel that you were carrying around with you. Some of them are deposit feeders, so they go down in the bottom and they just eat the mud and then extract whatever food is in there, detritus, little microbes and things. And then there are some that are carnivorous. They're called oyster drills, and what they do is they have a modified radula that is like a drill, and it can drill into other shells, which it drills into oysters, and they then can suck out the meat out of there. Rock snails are coral feeders, so they crawl around on coral and eat the coral. Cone snails have a modified radula that's like a harpoon with poison in it. So they can actually sting their prey, and some of them eat other snails and things like that. And those ones aren't as poisonous because they just eat a snail and they can sting it and wait for a while till it dies. But some of them eat fish, and the ones that eat fish are the most poisonous, because if you can imagine, if a snail stung a fish and it took the fish an hour to die, that snail would never find the fish. So the ones that eat fish are super poisonous, and the fish die instantly. There are also plankton feeders. The violet snail makes a bubble raft, and it floats in the open ocean, and it eats plankton. There are some nudibranchs that eat sponges, and they can retain the toxins from a sponge. And that way they use that so that other animals don't eat them. And there are some that eat hydroids, and they may retain the nematocysts from the hydroids, and they can keep those in their body so that other things don't eat them, because now they are poisonous. So we'll take a look at some of these animals. These are limpets or opihi, and we're used to seeing these kind of opihi here in Hawaii. In the mainland, they have giant keyhole limpets, which are like opihi but much larger. Abalone are another very large gastropod, which they have holes on their back to exchange gases, and these can also grow to be quite large. This is a cowrie, and cowries are very common in Hawaii and culturally important as they were used for making fishing lures and octopus lures. This is an auger shell, and augers can twist their body and dig down into the sand. So they live under the sand and they crawl through the sand and eat the little microbes that live in the sand. This is a Cooper's nutmeg snail, and it can insert its proboscis into an electric ray and then sucks the blood out of the ray. So at the right you can see the radula from the Cooper's nutmeg snail. This is a textile cone. This is one of the more poisonous cone snails, and cone snails are very common in Hawaii. There's many different species, and as I mentioned before, some of them are much more poisonous than others. But they all are poisonous to some degree. So a good rule of thumb is if you ever find one of these in the water, don't pick it up and put it in your pocket, because you never know. You could get stung too. And that has happened to people, and some of them are so poisonous that you could even die. Luckily here in Hawaii, the ones we have aren't quite as poisonous as some in other places, but still it could be quite painful. So if you find a cone snail, don't pick it up. Here's another cone snail, and you can see its proboscis sticking out here that would have the harpoon. These are the radula, which is modified into a harpoon from a cone textile cone that I showed you before, and it has this it looks just like a harpoon. This is a bubble snail, the one that floats along the surface. And this is a sea hare. This is the one that can harvest the chloroplasts from algae. And it has piercing teeth that pierce into the algae, and it sucks out the chloroplasts and stores them in their back so that they can use it as solar panels, so that they can go for a long time without food. Here's some other nudibranchs. They come in many different colors and really beautiful. Now, some people get these mixed up with the flatworms. Remember, we saw the flatworms and they were very colorful too. But the flatworms are much flatter than these. These are thicker, and also these have their gills on the outside. You can see right here. Those gills are, that's why they're called nudibranch, because nuda and branch has to do with its breathing. Like, you can think of your lungs, your bronchial tubes. And nudie is that they're on the outside. Here's some other nudibranchs, just very, very colorful. The one on the left is one of those ones that lives on stinging hydroids. So this one right here, these are hydroids that it's on. And they eat the hydroids. They take the stinging cells and keep them in their body so that they will not be eaten by other animals because they have those toxins. And one thing to note here is, see how brightly colored they are? Remember, in nature, a lot of the brightly colored things are toxic. And these nudibranchs are not toxic on their own, but they're getting their toxin from their hydroids that they're eating. Next, we'll look at class Bivalvia. That means two shells. And they're also called pelecypods sometimes, or hatchet foot. And these are the clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. All the good ones to eat. They are laterally compressed. They don't have a head, and they don't have radula. They have two shells, or valves, and they are filter feeders. So they don't have the radula, they don't scrape algae. What they do is they filter feed, they suck in food out of the water. And they have gills to breathe. They can move around, they can dig into the sediment with their muscular foot and hold on. Some of them can be free swimming, such as scallops, and some are attached, like oysters and mussels, and they have attachment threads that hold them in place, so they can live in very rough environments, like right in the intertidal zone where waves are crashing on them. Here's a diagram of a bivalve. So you can see the parts that they have. They have their stomach, their mouth and their stomach, their foot, the mantle, which makes the shell. These are the gills. And then they have an in-current siphon where the water siphons in, and then excurrent where it siphons out. They also have a heart. So this is a clam and a bucket of clams that someone's going to eat, and an oyster. And these are oysters growing on a piling. This is a scallop. I love scallops. They're one of my favorite food. This is also a scallop. There are some very beautiful scallops in the tropics in coral reefs. And this is a giant clam. So you can see the clam, the shell is kind of embedded in the reef. And this is the mantle right here. And that clam can open and close. And those bright colors you're seeing are from the zooxanthellae that live in them. This is the one that I was telling you about that has the single-celled dinoflagellate called zooxanthellae that live inside them that can photosynthesize and provide food for them. So they can filter feed, and they can also get food from their zooxanthellae. The next group are the cephalopods, and this is the class Cephalopoda, which means head, foot. And this is going to be the octopus, squid, cuttlefish, and nautilus. And they are active predators and very efficient hunters. And their foot is modified into tentacles and arms, and most of them have suckers on them. They have a thick muscular mantle, and they either have a very reduced shell or no shell at all. So some, like squid and cuttlefish, have a very small little shell that's internal. And they can swim by using jet propulsion. They have a very complex nervous system and a very well-developed eye. So here's a diagram of an octopus. So you can see here, and remember, the front end of an animal is the anterior end, and this is the posterior end, is the back end. So the front end is where the eyes are. And then we have the head right here. So you can see here the head, and then the body right behind, and then all the arms. And all of its internal organs are up in this head area. But they have lots of nerves that go to its arms, so they're very good at sensing things. They also have the addition of an ink sac in an octopus, and I'm sure you've seen where they can shoot ink out if they feel startled. Here's an octopus. Very beautiful animals that can change colors as soon as they land somewhere. And squid, this is a squid that's laying eggs, and you can see all these eggs. Here's when the squids are laying eggs, and after they lay all their eggs, they die. Same with octopus. They will put all their energy into reproduction, and then the mother dies. But she leaves behind hundreds, if not thousands, of babies. And here's a model of a squid. So you can see all the parts that are in a squid. And this is right from your textbook. You can see this in your book. And here's a squid with its chromatophores. You can see all the colors there, how they can change and make their color change with their chromatophores. Cuttlefish and a chambered nautilus, which are almost like living fossils. There are animals that are similar to chambered nautilus that have been around for millions of years. So that's just a short tour of the phylum Mollusca. Hui ho!